Hi, this is Pastor Barry, here with an introduction video to our series on Philippians. Not all discipleship groups are doing Philippians, and it's not required of your group. You can choose anything that you like at this time. However, a number of groups will be following Philippians because it's what's going to be taught on Sunday mornings. And so this video is set up to help you find resources and help for how to study the book of Philippians. First, I want to introduce some resources to you. All of these are downloadable right here on the Discipleship Group's website. The first is a manuscript of Philippians. You can see what this looks like here. It's just the book of Philippians typed out, double-spaced with wide margins to give people a chance to mark and write down their questions and those sorts of things. There are helps in this section. You can download them for free that tell you how to do this kind of study, and I would certainly be glad to help you with it myself. Another thing that you'll find in that space below is this sheet. It's the breakdown of the Sunday messages, which not only will tell you what's coming up on Sunday, as well as some associated events of the church, but also gives you a clue as to when your group might want to be studying a certain passage. In general, I recommend that you study passages before Pastor Wayne or whoever's speaking teaches them on Sunday. The reason for this is simple. There are some people, maybe it's a lot of people, who once they've heard a compelling message on a passage of the Bible, then whenever they read that passage, that's all they can hear is what somebody else said about it. And so we're trying to set up the situation where people are able to come to the Bible and hear God speak even before they ever hear a pastor open it. So you don't have to study it that way, but that is the way that we often recommend. This sheet is a sheet that I put together, really just edited on background information for Philippians. It's the usual study Bible or commentary kind of stuff about who is the author of Philippians, where was he when he wrote Philippians, what were the circumstances under which he wrote it, etc. Whether you use this one or the one in your study Bible or what have you, my only caution would be this: these things are not inspired by God, okay? Somebody is doing the best they can to put together the historical background on something, but what you'll find is there's some disagreements over, for instance, where Paul was imprisoned when he wrote the book. And so, those would be things that you can take with a grain of salt, helpful to know as an idea, but I wouldn't necessarily put a ton of weight on it. The last thing I'll show you is actually not in the section below, but it is on our group leader training tab there on the Discipleship Group's website. And it says small group training resources. Basically, this is something that I think would be good for discipleship group leaders and really for your whole group as you try to grow as a group. These resources will help you to think about what your next steps might be as a group, how to progress. So, okay. The last thing is this sheet that says help for reading and discussing Philippians, which is going to be the basis of everything that I'm going to say from here on out. So if you just rather read it, you can download it and read it. I'm just going to go through it in a relatively quick way to try to explain some of what I mean here. I'm hoping that it will take like 10 minutes. So, okay. So I have 6 things listed here. The first is, remember that Philippians is a letter. People get weird about the Bible. They treat the Bible like it's some kind of magic book that fell from heaven that they're supposed to be able to open up and find guidance for their life. And certainly, I think God wants to guide us through the Bible. But it's a helpful thing to remember that the Bible while inspired by God, was written by human authors who were in particular situations and writing to particular audiences. And it can help us to read more accurately when we understand all of those circumstances. My daughter is doing some research for her master's thesis right now. And so she went down to the Bay Area. She had these big boxes full of letters and other kinds of resources. And reading Philippians is a little bit like that. When she picks up a letter, she has to ask herself, who wrote this? And who did they write it to? And what were they thinking about when they wrote this letter? Like, what were they trying to communicate? What is their hope in writing this letter? Are there particular circumstances about which I should be aware as I read this letter? It's like listening to one side of a conversation. And so as you read Philippians, my first piece of advice is to remember that it's a letter and it's half of a conversation, and to think about all of those questions. What can we infer about Paul's relationship with the Philippians? What can we figure out about his circumstances and theirs? What can we figure out about why he wrote this letter, what he's hoping for? And I think you'll be surprised that even without any outside helps, you can actually figure out a whole lot about who wrote the letter, what their circumstances were, and why they wrote the letter, just from the letter itself. Okay, so that's the first thing. Remember that Philippians is a letter and read it accordingly. Second thing is to think about relationships. When people think about the great theological topics of the Bible, when they think about gospel and salvation and some of these other things, they'll often turn to a book like Romans or Galatians. They don't often turn to Philippians because Philippians is a different kind of letter. And so rather than trying to force certain subjects onto Philippians, I think it's a helpful thing to think about what is Paul actually addressing in Philippians. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not saying that Philippians doesn't say anything about those other subjects, and we'll get to that in a minute. But we need to remember what Paul's agenda is here in Philippians and read it accordingly. And one of his big agendas here is relationships. What does he say about the kind of relationship that we are to have with God? What does he say about the kind of relationships that we're to have with other people and different kinds of people, with our partners, with our rivals, and even with our enemies? So think about relationships, because Paul has a lot to say about that. Third thing, pay attention to the examples that Paul uses. Don't just skip over the examples. The examples are hugely important. How should we be like these people, or how should we not be like them? He uses some negative examples, and why are they negative, and what are we trying to avoid in the things that they do, or the attitudes that they have. The fourth thing, in every passage, there are some basic questions that you can ask. This is probably true more generally about the Bible, but I find them to be especially appropriate when reading Philippians. So here are the questions. One of them is, or one section of questions is, what can we discern about common Bible words like gospel, salvation, and faith? Does Paul use those words the same way that we do? And if not, what does he mean by them? I'm kind of tipping my hand a little bit here in saying that I think that Paul uses those terms in ways that are different than we do, and that we ought to let Paul define what gospel is and what salvation is and how it operates, what faith is, and not import our own idea of those concepts onto Philippians. Secondly, what does faith look like? Now, obviously, faith can be a little bit ineffable, right? It's a bit abstract. We don't think of it as something that we can see. But Paul actually talks about a lot of ways that we could see faith. So, what does it look like when a person is being faithful or when they're not? And that's that third question. What are the marks of unfaithfulness that we see in the letter that we should be praying against or trying to avoid? That could be almost as important as knowing what faith is. So, what is the other side of that coin? What does unfaithfulness look like? How do we avoid it? The fifth and really final thing here, I mean, I introduced some resources in number 6, but the final thing about Philippians is this. There are some things that are hidden in the Greek, and I try to point them out in my handout, so you might want to download that. But a couple of things, and I'll just mention them here briefly. One is there is a Greek word, soteria, which appears 3 times. It's in 119, 128, and 212. It's the word that is often translated salvation, but in some of your versions, it doesn't translate it that way in chapter 1, verse 19. And so why do the translators make that choice, and do you think it was a good choice? What do you think Paul means in 119 with the use of this word, especially as you compare it to the way that he uses it in other places? In 128, he talks about our refusal to be intimidated as a sign of destruction for our opponents, but of salvation for ourselves. And in 212, he says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. And so that same word that gets translated salvation is sometimes translated release or deliverance in chapter 1, verse 19. What does Paul mean in 119? And should that be translated salvation? He says, I know that this will result in my something. A Common English Bible says it will result in my release. Some other versions will say it results in my deliverance. Is Paul saying that he knows that he will get out of prison, or is he talking about something else? The other thing that I think is worth looking at, and I'll mention this in my Sunday message at the beginning of Philippians, but it's the use of this word koinonia. Some of you might know that word as meaning fellowship. It also gets translated partnership, participation, partaking, or sharing. And the question here, I think, is what kind of relationship is this? And who is Paul hoping that will have that kind of relationship with? The last thing, in number 6, I just selected some resources from the Discipleship Group Resources Library here at the Lighthouse Center. Feel free to come by and use them. Briefly, they are the IVP Bible Background Commentary, New Testament. This is a book that is not like your average commentary. Instead of telling you what verses mean, it gives you background information, historical background, cultural background, Old Testament background, in a way that helps you to decide what it means rather than just telling you. We also have a copy of the Serendipity Bible for Groups. I like groups to come up with their own questions when they're studying a Bible passage, but if you want to have a few tucked away just in case, the Serendipity Bible for Groups has questions about every passage in the entire Bible. It's like a whole library of Bible study guides. Highly recommended. A third book that you can take a look at is the Bible Reader's Companion. This is like a study Bible, except bigger. And so it has helpful commentary and background notes on Philippians. I do include a bit of a warning in my flyer. I'll let you read that if you're interested. But as always, read with a critical eye. Don't believe everything that you read just because it's in a book or on the internet. Lastly, I recommend the Tyndale New Testament commentary on Philippians. It is a Bible commentary, but it's easy to read, very accessible, and probably none of you are going to read that whole book. But if you come up with a question or a problem in a passage, that would be a good place to go. We have several other Bible commentaries. I don't mean to say that that's the best one, only that it's one that we have and it's pretty accessible. So anyway, that's my introduction to our series on Philippians. I hope that you'll have a terrific time this spring studying the Bible, and whether you're studying Philippians or not, connecting with God and with one another in ways that grow your life with God. So God bless you. I will not be doing weekly videos for this series, but I did want to do one just to kind of give you some places to start and to be able to bless your time together in your group.